The first thing that snapped in this war was not a regime. It was movement. After February 28th, tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz came close to a standstill, and the most important energy artery on Earth stopped behaving like open sea and started behaving like a wounded nerve. That is where the real fear begins, because once normal movement dies, Tehran does not need a cinematic victory at sea. It only needs to prove that the world can no longer cross this water, as if Iran's permission no longer matters. Then the story got worse. Ships were being pushed into Iranian waters, vetted by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and at least 2 vessels were reported to have paid for safe passage. That means Hormuz was no longer just being threatened. It was beginning to behave like a checkpoint. A threat lives in the future. This is what makes Hormuz different. Tehran had already started changing how ships move, who feels safe, and what the world is willing to call normal. And the route itself exposed the truth. Ships were no longer moving through the usual center of the channel but bending north, closer to the Iranian coast, entering Tehran's territorial waters, and Tehran's rules. That is not a warning shot. That is the map itself beginning to obey pressure. If you want war explained at the point where states stop talking and start squeezing the world, subscribe now. And in the comments, tell me what Hormuz really is now. A blockade, a toll booth, or America's blind spot, because how you answer that tells me whether you've seen the battlefield underneath the headlines. At its narrowest point, Hormuz is only 22 nautical miles wide, with 2 shipping lanes that are each just 2 miles wide, separated by a 2-mile buffer, and those lanes lie inside Iranian and Omani territorial waters. That one fact explains why this strait is Tehran's last big weapon. Geography is fighting for Iran before Iran even fires. So now the title becomes brutally simple. Hormuz is Tehran's last big weapon because so many of its other levers can be degraded, hunted, or bombed. But this one cannot be removed from the map, and it cannot be neutralized just by blowing holes in targets. If America can dominate the sky and still fail to make Hormuz feel open, then what exactly has been broken? That is the question carrying this whole story. Because winning looks very different once your enemy no longer has to beat you everywhere and only has to make one narrow place feel permanently dangerous. Tehran's surviving toolkit fits Hormuz perfectly. It can divert or seize tankers, or strike them with fast attack craft, drones, anti-ship missiles, or naval mines in a wide ocean that mix is harassment. In Hormuz, it becomes a machine for coercion, and here is the ugly genius of that machine. Iran does not need perfect sea denial. It does not need to sink every ship. It only needs to keep risk alive above the level where captains, crews, insurers, and traders stop behaving like the route is normal. That is why the phrase last big weapon matters so much. Not last asset, not last threat. Weapon. A weapon is something that changes enemy behavior, and Hormuz is already doing that even before anyone agrees on the legal vocabulary for what Tehran is building there. The scale of the trap is what gives Tehran this leverage. Around 20 million barrels per day of oil normally move through Hormuz. Roughly 1/5 of global LNG trade depends on it, and the spare bypass capacity outside the strait is only about 2.6 million barrels per day through Saudi and UAE pipelines. That is not a replacement system. That is a pressure relief valve on a failing machine. So when people say the world can just route around Hormuz, they are speaking in abstractions. Energy systems do not reroute cleanly when the main artery is carrying this much weight. They buckle, they distort, they ration, and then they start exporting fear into prices, shipping schedules, and government decisions. This is why Hormuz is not just important. It is scalable pain. A weakened Iran can no longer threaten the whole board with equal force. But this one choke point lets Tehran turn limited surviving capability into global consequence. That is the exact definition of a last weapon used. Well, now look at why Washington still cannot break it. A destroyer can intercept missiles, but it cannot at the same time sweep mines, counter drone boat swarms from multiple bearings, and handle disrupted navigation. In Hormuz, every answer creates another exposed flank, because too many threats are compressed into too little water. This is the part speeches hide. Reopening a contested choke point is not one action, it is layers on layers on layers. Surveillance, air cover, mine countermeasures, convoy discipline, fast strike response, and constant endurance under stress. That is not a dramatic victory moment. That is industrial-scale maintenance under fire, and even that only solves half the problem. Military presence can contest danger, but it cannot command trust. If crews still believe the next crossing could turn into fire, if insurers still price the route like a death corridor, then the strait remains weaponized no matter how many flags are sailing nearby. Inside Washington, the clearest admission was also the most devastating one. Iran has real leverage in Hormuz, and there is not an obvious fix for it. That single sentence does more damage to the victory narrative than 100 angry speeches, because it reveals the strategic wound behind the bravado. That is why the title's second half is so sharp. Washington still cannot break Hormuz as a weapon, because breaking it does not mean damaging Iran. It means restoring boring, predictable, commercially trusted movement through a corridor that Tehran has already taught the world to fear. That is a completely different standard of success. Bombing a target is an event. Rebuilding confidence is a condition. Iran only has to prevent that condition from returning. America has to recreate it and then prove it will hold. The coalition picture exposes the same truth from another direction. No country appears willing to force the strait open while the fighting is still active, and Iran can still target vessels with anti-ship missiles, drones, attack craft, and mines. That is not hesitation for the sake of optics. It is recognition that the first hard push could become the next disaster. And every day that hard push does not happen makes Iran's leverage feel more solid. Tehran does not need universal recognition. It only needs enough caution, enough delay, and enough allied reluctance that its control starts looking less like improvisation and more like a new operating reality. That is where the information war enters the water. Tehran wants this to look like regulation, selective safety, managed passage for the right ships. Washington wants it to look like extortion, coercion, and illegal hostage-taking. But the behavior underneath both narratives is what matters. And the behavior has already changed. Another line from inside the U.S. system cuts even deeper. There was no indication of any near-term solution to a problem large enough to threaten the international economy. That matters because it turns Hormuz from a tactical nuisance into a test of whether American power can still restore order faster than a wounded adversary can spread disorder. And this is exactly the reason the audience clicks a title like this. People are trying to understand how a state under direct pressure can still make the stronger side look strategically unfinished. The answer is not mystery. It is asymmetry. Tehran's remaining power sits exactly where the cost of cleaning up is far higher than the cost of making the mess. That is why victory talk sounds so brittle around Hormuz. You can kill commanders. You can crater sites. You can destroy platforms and pens and launchers. But if the world's most important energy choke point still moves like a corridor under selective permission, then every claim of control is carrying an invisible asterisk. History makes the dilemma harsher, not easier. The same strategic memory that includes Operation Earnest Will, Operation Prime Chance, Operation Nimble Archer, and Operation Praying Mantis leads to the same modern conclusion. There is no silver bullet, and reopening the strait and keeping it open will demand major risk, major resources, and time. Even the older Gulf convoy era did not produce clean reassurance. And this environment is worse. The threat picture is denser, the market reaction is faster, the political patience is thinner, and the requirement is no longer just military passage. It is commercial normality. That is a much harder threshold to hit, especially when the enemy only needs to keep one shadow alive across one stretch of water. This is why Tehran chose the strait as the place to make it stand. A regime that cannot match the United States symmetrically can still drag the United States into a mission that is slow, thankless, technical, and permanently vulnerable to one more surprise. Hormuz turns American overmatch into American burden. And if Tehran thickens the problem with mines, the calendar itself becomes part of the weapon. A significant mine threat could take weeks or months to clear. That means one successful layer of contamination can trap the stronger side inside a cleanup mission, while the political and economic pressure keeps spreading outward. That is how time becomes Iranian leverage. Not because Tehran is stronger in absolute terms, but because it can make everyone else spend more time, more money, more ships, more credibility, and more explanation just to claw back a version of normal that used to exist for free. This is not only sea denial. It is pressure architecture. A drone does not just threaten steel. It threatens insurance. A mine does not just threaten hulls. It threatens calendars. A rerouted tanker does not just change a line on a map. It changes who the world thinks is setting the rules. And the exposure runs far beyond one market. Hormuz normally carries about 20 million barrels per day and around 1/5 of global LNG trade. So even partial disruption does not stay local. It travels outward into fuel costs, into freight, into industrial planning, and into governments that suddenly realize how much of their stability still depends on one narrow corridor. No one can feel normal on command. This is where Tehran's weakness turns into reach. Iran no longer needs to dominate the region in every direction. It only needs one lever that still travels globally. Hormuz gives it that reach because the world built dependence into the geography long before this phase of the war began. And that is why the audience should not think of Hormuz as a side front. It is the front that judges all the others. If the route remains psychologically poisoned, then the war's other tactical successes start serving a narrower purpose. They become damage without closure. Look again at Tehran's surviving menu of disruption. Fast attack craft, drones, anti-ship missiles, naval mines, and the ability to divert or seize tankers. None of those needs to produce total closure to work. In Hormuz, partial disruption is enough. Because what Tehran is really attacking is not just transit, it is predictability. That is what makes this weapon so difficult to break. Washington is trying to restore predictability in a corridor where Iran only has to preserve unpredictability. One side is doing repair, the other is doing sabotage. Repair is always slower, and for the merchant crews trapped inside this equation, that difference is not abstract. It means every transit becomes a referendum on whether the superpower protecting the lane has actually made it safe, or only made it look defended. Those are not the same thing, and everyone in the market knows it. So when analysts say there is no silver bullet and reopening the strait will require risk, resources, and time, that is not caution for its own sake. It is the recognition that Hormuz is the war's maker. Break issue precisely because it can outlive air campaigns, outlast messaging, and keep bleeding pressure into the global system after the battlefield appears to have narrowed. That is the point most official statements try to blur. Tehran's last big weapon is not powerful because Iran is strong everywhere. It is powerful because this one lever reaches into places airstrikes cannot stabilize. It reaches into balance sheets, into diplomatic restraint, into alliance friction, and into the private fear of people whose ships are not built to become symbols. Now the closing logic becomes hard enough to trust. If Tehran hardens this selective passage system into something more formal, then it has turned geography into rent and fear into maritime authority. If that system collapses tomorrow, the deeper conclusion still survives. A weakened Iran still proved it could freeze the world's most important energy choke point long enough to expose the limits of American conversion of military superiority into normal commerce. And that is why even the possibility of weeks or months of mine clearance matters so much. The longer Hormuz can be kept in a condition of fear, the more Tehran's last weapon stops looking temporary and starts looking structural. The strait does not need to be permanently closed to permanently change how this war is understood. So here's the ruthless answer to the title. Hormuz is Tehran's last big weapon because it is the one surviving lever that can still scale Iranian weakness into worldwide pain. And Washington still cannot break it because breaking it means more than firing harder. It means making the world believe this corridor is ordinary again. Right now, it isn't. Stay with this channel. Because when the choke point becomes the truth of the war, this is where you'll see it before everyone else says it out loud.